Good evening. Happy Sunday. I hope we're all doing well today. For those who are joining me for a reading stream who haven't before, we are picking up with a selection of short stories by M.R. James. For those who are returning, welcome back. And I have my tea here. I have a nice iced hibiscus tea. I have my water. So let's go ahead and get right back into the Victorian horror of M.R. James. The Diary of Mr. Poynter. The sale room of an old and famous firm of book auctioneers in London is, of course, a great meeting place for collectors, librarians, dealers, not only when an auction is in progress, but perhaps even more notably when books that are coming on for sale are upon view. It was in such a sale room that the remarkable series of events began which were detailed to me not many months ago by the person whom they principally affected, namely, Mr. James Denton, M.A., F.S.A., etc., etc., some time of Trinity Hall, now or lately of Rencombe Manor in the county of Warwick. He, on a certain spring day not many years since, was in London for a few days upon business connected principally with the furnishing of the home which he had just finished building at Rencombe. It may be a disappointment to you to learn that Rencombe Manor was new. That I cannot help. There had no doubt been an old house, but it was not remarkable for beauty or interest. Even had it been, neither beauty nor interest would have enabled it to resist the disastrous fire which about a couple of years before the date of my story had razed it to the ground. I am glad to say that all that was most valuable in it had been saved, and that it was fully insured. So that it was with a comparatively light heart that Mr. Denton was able to face the task of building a new and considerably more convenient dwelling for himself and his aunt, who constituted his whole ménage. Being in London with time on his hands and not far from the sale room at which I have obscurely hinted, Mr. Denton thought that he would spend an hour thereupon the chance of finding, among the portion of the famous Thomas collection of MSS, which he knew to be then on view, something bearing upon the history or topography of his part of Warwickshire. He turned in accordingly, purchased a catalogue, and ascended to the sale-room where, as usual, the books were disposed in cases and some laid out upon the long tables. At the shelves, or sitting about at the tables, were figures, many of whom were familiar to him. He exchanged nods and greetings with several, and then settled down to examine his catalogue and note likely items. He had made good progress through about 200 of the 500 lots, every now and then rising to take a volume from the shelf and give it a cursory glance, when a hand was laid on his shoulder, and he looked up. His interrupter was one of those intelligent men with a pointed beard and a flannel shirt, of whom the last quarter of the 19th century was, it seems to me, very prolific. It is no part of my plan to repeat the whole conversation which ensued between the two. I must content myself with stating that it largely referred to common acquaintances, e.g., to the nephew of Mr. Denton's friend who had recently married and settled in Chelsea, to the sister-in-law of Mr. Denton's friend who had been seriously indisposed, but was now better, and to a piece of china which Mr. Denton's friend had purchased some months before at a price much below its true value. From which you will rightly infer that the conversation was rather in the nature of a monologue. In due time, however, the friend bethought himself that Mr. Denton was there for a purpose, and said he, "What are you looking out for in particular? I don't think there's much in this lot." "Why, I thought there might be some Warwickshire collections, but I don't see anything under Warwick in the catalogue." "No, apparently not," said the friend. "All the same, I believe I noticed something like a Warwickshire diary. What was the name again? Drayton, Potter, Paynter, either a P or a D, I feel sure." He turned the leaves quickly. "Yes, here it is, Poynter, lot 486. That might interest you. There are the books, I think, out on the table. Someone has been looking at them. Well, I must be getting on. Goodbye. You'll look us up, won't you? Couldn't you come this afternoon? We've got a little music about 4. Well, then when you're next in town." He went off. Mr. Denton looked at his watch and found to his confusion that he could spare no more than a moment before retrieving his luggage and going for the train. The moment was just enough to show him that there were 4 largest volumes of the diary, that it concerned the years of about 1710, and that there seemed to be a good many insertions in it of various kinds. It seemed quite worthwhile to leave a commission of £25 for it, and this he was able to do, for his usual agent entered the room as he was on the point of leaving it. That evening he rejoined his aunt at their temporary abode, which was a small dower house not many 100 yards from the manor. On the following morning the two resumed a discussion that had now lasted for some weeks as to the equipment of the new house. Mr. Denton laid before his relative a statement of the results of his visit to town, particulars of carpets, of chairs, of wardrobes, and of bedroom china. "Yes, dear," said his aunt, "but I don't see any chintzes here. Did you go to—" Mr. Denton stamped on the floor. Where else, indeed, could he have stamped? Oh dear, he said. "The one thing I missed. I am sorry. The fact is, I was on my way there, and I happened to be passing Robin's." His aunt threw up her hands. "Robin's! Then the next thing will be another parcel of horrible old books at some outrageous price. I do think, James, when I am taking all this trouble for you, you might contrive to remember the one or two things which I specially begged you to see after. It's not as if I was asking it for myself. I don't know whether you think I get any pleasure out of it, but if so, I can assure you it's very much the reverse. The thought and worry and trouble I have over it you have no idea of, and you have simply to go to the shops and order the things." Mr. Denton interposed a moan of penitence. "Oh, aunt, yes, that's all very well, dear, and I don't want to speak sharply, but you must know how very annoying it is. Particularly as it delays the whole of our business, for I can't tell how long. Here's Wednesday, the Simpsons come tomorrow, and you can't leave them. Then on Saturday we have friends, as you know, coming for tennis. Yes, indeed, you spoke of asking them yourself, but of course I had to write the notes, and it is ridiculous, James, to look like that. We must occasionally be civil to our neighbours. You wouldn't like to have it said we were perfect bears. What was I saying? Well, anyhow, it comes to this, that it must be Thursday and next week at least before you can go to town again, and until we have decided upon the chintzes, it is impossible to settle upon one single other thing." Mr. Denton ventured to suggest that as the paint and wallpapers had been dealt with, this was too severe a view, but that his aunt was not prepared to admit at the moment. Nor, indeed, was there any proposition he could have advanced which she would have found herself able to accept. However, as the day went on, she receded a little from this position, examined with the lessening disfavour of the samples and price lists submitted by her nephew, and even in some cases gave a qualified approval to his choice. As for him, he was naturally somewhat dashed by the consciousness of duty unfulfilled, but more so by the prospect of a lawn tennis party, which, though an inevitable evil in August, he had thought there was no occasion to fear in May. But he was to some extent cheered by the arrival on the Friday morning of an intimation that he had secured at the price of shillings. That's an old currency. The 4 volumes of Poynter's manuscript diary, and still more by the arrival on the next morning of the diary itself. The necessity of taking Mr. and Mrs. Simpson for a drive in the car on Saturday morning and of attending to his neighbours and guests the afternoon prevented him from doing more than open the parcel until the party had retired to bed on the Saturday night. It was then that he made certain of the fact which he had before only suspected, that he had indeed acquired the diary of Mr. William Poynter, squire of Accrington, about 4 miles from his own parish. That same Poynter, who was for a time a member of the circle of Oxford antiquaries, the centre of which was Thomas Hearne, and with whom Hearne seems ultimately to have quarrelled, a not uncommon episode in the career of that excellent man. As is the case with Hearne's own collections, the diary of Poynter contained a good many notes from printed books, descriptions of coins and other antiquities that had been brought to his notice, and drafts of letters on these subjects, besides the chronicle of everyday events. The description in the sales catalogue had given Mr. Denton no idea of the amount of interest which seemed to lie in the book, and he sat up reading in the first of the 4 volumes until a reprehensibly late hour. On the Sunday morning after church, his aunt came into the study and was diverted from what she had been going to say to him by the sight of the 4 brown leather quartos on the table. "What are these?" she said suspiciously. "New, aren't they? Oh, are these the things that made you forget my chintzes? I thought so. Disgusting. What did you give for them, I should like to know? Over £10, James, it is really sinful. Well, if you have money to throw away on this kind of thing, there can be no reason why you should not subscribe, and subscribe handsomely, to my Anti-Vivisection League. There is not, indeed, James, and I shall be very seriously annoyed if... who did you say wrote them? Old Mr. Poynter of Accrington? Well, of course, there is some interest in getting together old papers about this neighborhood, but £10! She picked up one of the volumes, not that which her nephew had been reading, and opened it at random, dashing it to the floor the next instant with a cry of disgust as an earwig fell from between the pages. Mr. Denton picked it up with a smothered expletive and said, "Poor book, I think you're rather hard on Mr. Poynter." "Was I, my dear? I beg his pardon, but you know I cannot abide those horrid creatures. Let me see if I've done any mischief." "No, I think all's well, but look here what you've opened him on." "Dear me, yes, to be sure. How very interesting. Do unpin it, James, and let me look at it." It was a piece of patterned stuff about the size of the quarto page, to which it was fastened by an old-fashioned pin. James detached it and handed it to his aunt, carefully replacing the pin in the paper. Now, I do not know exactly what the fabric was, but it had a design printed upon it which completely fascinated Miss Denton. She went into raptures over it, held it against the wall, made James do the same, that she might retire to contemplate it from a distance, then pored over it at close quarters, and ended her examination by expressing in the warmest terms her appreciation of the taste of the ancient Mr. Poynter, who had had the happy idea of preserving this sample in his diary. "It is a most charming pattern," she said, "and remarkable, too. Look, James, how delightfully the lines ripple. It reminds one of hair very much, doesn't it? And then these knots of ribbon at intervals, they give just the relief of colour that is wanted. I was going to say," said James with deference, "I wonder if it would cost much to have it copied for our curtains." "Copied? How could you have it copied, James?" "Well, I don't know the details, but I suppose that is a printed pattern, and that you could have a block cut from it in wood or metal." "Now, really, that is a capital idea, James. I am almost inclined to be glad that you forgot the chintzes on Monday. At any rate, I'll promise to forgive and forget if you get this lovely old thing copied. No one will have anything in the least like it, and mind, James, we won't allow it to be sold. Now, I must go, and I've totally forgotten what it was I came in to say. Never mind, it'll keep." After his aunt had gone, James Denton devoted a few minutes to examining the pattern more closely than he had yet had a chance of doing. He was puzzled to think why it should have struck Miss Denton so forcibly. It seemed to him not specially remarkable or pretty. No doubt it was suitable enough for a curtain pattern. It ran in vertical bands, and there was some indication that these were intended to converge at the top. She was right, too, in thinking that these main bands resembled rippling, almost curling, tresses of hair. Well, the main thing was to find out by means of trade directories or otherwise what firm would undertake the reproduction of an old pattern of this kind. Not to delay the reader over this portion of the story, a list of likely names was made out, and Mr. Denton fixed a day for calling on them, or some of them, with his sample. The first 2 visits which he paid were unsuccessful, but there is luck in odd numbers. The firm in Bermondsey, which was 3rd on his list, was accustomed to handling this line. The evidence they were able to produce justified their being entrusted with the job. Our Mr. Cattle took a fervent personal interest in it. "It's heart-rending, isn't it, sir?" he said, "to picture the quantity of really lovely medieval stuff of this kind that lays well nigh unnoticed in many of our residential country houses. Much of it in peril, I take it, of being cast aside as so much rubbish. What is it Shakespeare says? Unconsidered trifles. I often say he has a word for us all, sir. I say Shakespeare, but I'm well aware all don't hold with me there. I had something of an upset the other day when a gentleman came in, a titled man too he was, and I think he told me he'd wrote on the topic, and I happened to cite out something about Hercules and the painted cloth. Dear me, you never seen such a bother. But as to this, what you kindly confided to us, it's a piece of work we shall take a real enthusiasm in achieving it out to the very best of our ability. What man has done, as I was observing only a few weeks back to another esteemed client, man can do, and in 3 to 4 weeks' time, all being well, we shall hope to lay before you evidence to that effect, sir. Take the address, Mr. Riggins, if you please." Such was the general drift of Mr. Cattle's observations on the occasion of his first interview with Mr. Denton. About a month later, being advised that some samples were ready for his inspection, Mr. Denton met him again and had, it seems, reason to be satisfied with the faithfulness of the reproduction of the design. It had been finished off at the top in accordance with the indication I mentioned so that the vertical bands joined, but something still needed to be done in a way of matching the color of the original. Mr. Cattle had suggestions of a technical kind to offer, with which I need not bother you. He had also views as to the general desirability of the pattern, which were vaguely adverse. You say you don't wish this to be supplied excepting to personal friends equipped with an authorization from yourself, sir. It shall be done. I quite understand your wish to keep it exclusive. Lends a catch, it does it not, to the suite. What's every man's, it's been said, is no man's. Do you think it would be popular if it were generally obtainable? Asked Mr. Denton. I hardly think it is, sir, said Cattle, pensively clasping his beard. I hardly think it. Not popular? It wasn't popular with the man that cut the block, was it, Mr. Higgins? Did he find it a difficult job? He'd no call to do so, sir, but the fact is that the artistic temperament and our men are artists, sir, every man of 'em. True artist, as much as many that the world styles by that term, it's apt to take some strange, oddly accountable likes and dislikes, and here was an example. The twice or thrice that I went to inspect his progress, language I could understand, for that's habitual to him. But real distaste for what I should call a dainty enough thing I did not, nor am I now able to fathom. It seems, said Mr. Cattle, looking narrowly upon Mr. Denton, as if the man scented something almost evil in the design. Indeed. Did he tell you so? I can't say I see anything sinister in it myself. Neither can I, sir. In fact, I said as much. Come, Gatwick, I said. What's to do here? What's the reason of your prejudice? For I can call it no more than that. But no explanation was forthcoming, and I was merely reduced, as I am now, to a shrug of the shoulders and a cui bono. However, here it is. And with that, the technical side of the question came to the front again. The matching of the colors for the background, the hem, and the knots of ribbons was by far the longest part of the business, and necessitated many sendings to and fro of the original pattern and of new samples. During part of August and September, too, the Dentons were away from the manors, so that it was not until October was well in that a sufficient quantity of the stuff had been manufactured to furnish curtains for the 3 or 4 bedrooms which were to be fitted with it. On the feast of Simon and Jude, the aunt and nephew returned from a short visit to find all completed, and their satisfaction at the general effect was great. The new curtains in particular agreed to admiration with their surroundings. When Mr. Denton was addressing for dinner and took stock of the room, in which there was a large amount of the chintz displayed, he congratulated himself over and over again on the luck which had first made him forget his aunt's commission and had then put into his hands this extremely effective means of remedying the mistake. The pattern was, as he said at dinner, so restful and yet so far from being dull, and Miss Denton, who, by the way, had none of the stuff in her own room, was much disposed to agree with him. At breakfast next morning he was induced to qualify his satisfaction to some extent, but very slightly. There is one thing I rather regret, he said, that we allowed them to join up the vertical bands of the pattern at the top. I think it should have been better to leave that alone. Oh? Said his aunt interrogatively. Yes, as I was reading in bed last night, they kept catching my eye, rather. That is, I found myself looking across at them every now and then. There was an effect as if some one kept peeping out between the curtains in one place or another where there was no edge, and I think that was due to the joining up of the bands at the top. The only other thing that troubled me was the wind. Why, I thought it was a perfectly still night. Perhaps it was only on my side of the house, but there was enough to sway my curtains and rustle them more than I wanted. That night, a bachelor friend of James Denton's came to stay, and was lodged in a room on the same floor as his host, but at the end of a long passage, halfway down which was a red baize door put there to cut off the draught and intercept noise. The party of 3 had separated. Miss Denton a good first, the 2 men at about 11. James Denton, not yet inclined for bed, sat him down in an armchair and read for a time. Then he dozed, and then he woke and bethought himself that his brown spaniel, which ordinarily slept in his room, had not come upstairs with him. Then he thought he was mistaken, for happening to move his hand, which hung down over the arm of the chair within a few inches of the floor, he felt on the back of it just the slightest touch of a surface of hair, and stretching it out in that direction, he stroked and patted around it something, but the feel of it, and still more the fact that instead of a responsive movement, absolute stillness greeted his touch, made him look over the arm. What he had been touching rose to meet him. It was in the attitude of one that had crept along the floor on its belly, and it was, so far as could be collected, a human figure. But of the face which was now rising to within a few inches of his own, no feature was discernible, only hair. Shapeless as it was, there was about it so horrible an air of menace that as he bounded from his chair and rushed from the room, he heard himself moaning with fear, and doubtless he did right to fly. As he dashed into the baize door that cut the passage in two, and, forgetting that it opened towards him, beat against it with all force in him, he felt a soft, ineffectual tearing at his back, which all the same seemed to be growing in power, as if the hand, or whatever worse than a hand was there, were becoming more material as the pursuer's rage was more concentrated. Then he remembered the trick of the door. He got it open, he shut it behind him, he gained his friend's room, and that is all we need to know. It seems curious that, during all the time that had elapsed since the purchase of Poynter's diary, James Denton should not have sought an explanation of the presence of the pattern that had been pinned into it. Well, he had read the diary through without finding it mentioned, and had concluded that there was nothing to be said. But on leaving Rencombe Manor, he did not know whether for good, as he naturally insisted upon doing on the day after experiencing the horror I have tried to put into words, he took the diary with him. And at his seaside lodgings he examined more narrowly the portion whence the pattern had been taken. What he remembered having suspected about it turned out to be correct. 2 or 3 leaves were pasted together, but written upon as was patent when they were held up to the light. They yielded easily to steaming, for the paste had lost much of its strength, and they contained something relevant to the pattern. The entry was made in 1707. Old Mr. Casbury of Accrington told me this day much of young Sir Everard Charlotte, whom he remembered commoner of University College, and thought was of the same family as Dr. Arthur Charlotte, now master of something college. This Charlotte was a personable young gentleman, but a loose atheistical companion, and a great lifter, as they then called the hard drinkers, and subject to, and for what I know, do so now. He was noted and subject to several censures at different times for his extravagancies, and if the full history of his debaucheries had been known, no doubt would have been expelled from college, supposing that no interest had been employed on his behalf of which Mr. Casbury had some suspicion. He was a very beautiful person, and constantly wore his own hair, which was very abundant, from which, and his loose way of living, the cant name for him was Absalom, and he was accustomed to say that indeed he believed he had shortened old David's days, meaning his father, Sir Job Charlotte, an old worthy cavalier. Note that Mr. Casbury says that he remembers not the year of Sir Everard Charlotte's death, but it was 1692 or 3. He died suddenly in October. Several lines describing his unpleasant habits and reputed delinquencies are omitted. Having seen him in such topping spirits the night before, Mr. Casbury was amazed when he learned of his death. He was found in the town ditch, the hair, as was said, plucked clean off his head. Most bells in Oxford rung out for him, being a nobleman, and he was buried next night in St. Peter's in the East, but 2 years after, being to be moved to his country estate by his successor, it was said the coffin, breaking by mischance, proved quite full of hair. Which sounds fabulous, but yet I believe precedents are upon record, as in Dr. Plott's History of Staffordshire. His chambers being afterwards stripped, Mr. Casbury came by part of the hangings of it, which 'twas said this Charlotte had designed expressly for a memorial of his hair, giving the fellow that drew it a lock to work by, and the piece which I have fastened in here was a parcel of the same which Mr. Casbury gave to me. He said he believed there was a subtlety in the drawing, but had never discovered it himself, nor much light to pour upon it. The money spent upon the curtains might as well have been thrown into the fire as they were. Mr. Cattle's comment upon what he heard of the story took the form of a quotation from Shakespeare. You may guess it without difficulty. It began with the words, "There are more things." An episode of Cathedral history. There was once a learned gentleman who was deputed to examine and report upon the archives of the Cathedral of Southminster. The examination of these records demanded a very considerable expenditure of time, hence it became advisable for him to engage lodgings in the city, for though the cathedral body were profuse in their offers of hospitality, Mr. Lake felt that he would prefer to be master of his day. This was recognized as reasonable. The dean eventually wrote advising Mr. Lake, if he were not already suited, to communicate with Mr. Warby, the principal verger, who occupied a house convenient to the church and was prepared to take in a quiet lodger for 3 or 4 weeks. Such an arrangement was precisely what Mr. Lake desired. Terms were easily agreed upon, and early in December, like another Mr. Datchery, as he remarked to himself, the investigator found himself in the occupation of a very comfortable room in an ancient and cathedraly house. One so familiar with the customs of cathedral churches, and treated with such obvious consideration by the dean and chapter of this cathedral in particular, could not fail to command the respect of the head verger. Mr. Warby even acquiesced in certain modifications of statements he had been accustomed to offer for years to parties of visitors. Mr. Lake, on his part, found the verger a very cheery companion, and took advantage of any occasion that presented itself for enjoying his conversation when the day's work was over. One evening, about 9 o'clock, Mr. Warby knocked at his lodger's door. "I have occasion," he said, "to go across to the cathedral, Mr. Lake, and I think I made you a promise when I did so next I would give you the opportunity to see what it looks like at night time. It is quite fine and dry outside if you care to come." "To be sure I will. Very much obliged to you, Mr. Warby, for thinking of it, but let me get my coat." "Here it is, sir, and I've another lantern here that you'll find advisable for the steps, as there's no moon." "Anyone might think we were Jasper and Durdles over again, mightn't they?" said Lake as they crossed the close, for he had ascertained that the verger had read Edwin Drood. "Well, so they might," said Mr. Warby with a short laugh, "though I don't know whether we ought to take it as a compliment. Odd ways, I often think, they had at that cathedral. Don't it seem so to you, sir? Full choral matins at 7 o'clock in the morning all the year round wouldn't suit our boys' voices nowadays, and I think there's 1 or 2 of the men would be applying for a rise if the chapter was to bring it in, particularly the altos." They were now at the southwest door. As Mr. Warby was unlocking it, Lake said, "Did you ever find anybody locked in here by accident?" "Twice I did. One was a drunk sailor. However he got in, I don't know. I suppose he went to sleep in the service, but by the time I got to him, he was praying fit to bring the roof in. Lord, what a noise that man did make! Said it was the first time he'd been inside a church for 10 years, and blessed if ever he'd try it again. The other was an old sheep. Them boys it was, up to their games. That was the last time they tried it on, though. There, sir, now you see what we look like. Our late dean used now and again to bring parties in, but he preferred a moonlit night, and there was a piece of verse he'd quote to 'em, relating to a Scotch cathedral, I understand. I don't know. I almost think the effect's better when it's all dark like. Seems to add to the size and height. Now, if you won't mind stopping somewhere in the nave while I go up into the choir where my business lays, you'll see what I mean." Accordingly, Lake waited, leaning against a pillar, and watched the light wavering along the length of the church and up the steps into the choir until it was intercepted by some screen or other furniture which only allowed the reflection to be seen on the piers and roof. Not many minutes had passed before Warby reappeared at the door of the choir, and by waving his lantern signaled to Lake to rejoin him. "I suppose it is Warby, and not a substitute," thought Lake to himself as he walked up the nave. There was, in fact, nothing untoward. Warby showed him the papers which he had come to fetch out of the dean's stall, and asked him what he thought of the spectacle. Lake agreed that it was well worth seeing. "I suppose," he said, as they walked towards the altar steps together, "that you're too much used to going about here at night to feel nervous, but you must get a start every now and then, don't you, when a book falls down or a door swings to?" Well, no, Mr. Lake, I can't say think much about noises, not nowadays. I'm much more afraid of finding an escape of gas or a burst in the stovepipes than anything else. Still, there have been times years ago. Did you notice that plain altar tomb there? 15th century, we say it is. I don't know if you agree to that, but, well, if you didn't look at it, just come back and give it a glance if you'd be so good. It was on the north side of the choir and rather awkwardly placed, only about 3 feet from the enclosing stone screen. Quite plain, as the verger had said, but for some ordinary stone paneling. A metal cross of some size on the northern side, that next to the screen, was the solitary feature of any interest. Lake agreed that it was not earlier than the Perpendicular period, but, he said, unless it's the tomb of some remarkable person, you'll forgive me for saying that I don't think it's particularly noteworthy. Well, I can't say it's the tomb of anybody noted in history, said Warby, who had a dry smile on his face, for we don't own any record whatsoever of who it was put up to. For all that, if you've half an hour to spare, sir, when we get back to the house, Mr. Lake, I could tell you a tale about that tomb. I won't begin on it now. It strikes cold here, and we don't want to be dawdling about all night. Of course, I should like to hear it immensely. Very well, sir, you shall. Now, if I might put a question to you, he went on as they passed down the choir aisle. In our little guide, and not only there, but in the little book on our cathedral in the series, you'll find it stated that this portion of the building was erected previous to the 12th century. Now, of course, I should be glad enough to take that view, but mind the steps, sir. But I put it to you, does the lay of the stone here in this portion of the wall, which he tapped with his key, does it to your eye carry the flavor of what you might call Saxon masonry? No, I thought not. No more than it does to me. Now, if you'll believe me, I've said as much to those men. One's the library of our free library here, and the other came down from London on purpose 50 times if I have once. But I might just as well have talked to that bit of stonework. But there it is. I suppose everyone's got their opinions. The discussion of this peculiar trait of human nature occupied Mr. Warby almost up to the moment when he and Lake re-entered the former house. The condition of the fire in Lake's sitting room led to a suggestion from Mr. Warby that they should finish the evening in his own parlor. We find them accordingly settled there some short time afterwards. Mr. Warby made his story a long one, and I will not undertake to tell it wholly in his own words or in his own order. Lake committed the substance of it to paper immediately after hearing it, together with some few passages of the narrative which had fixed themselves verbatim in his mind. I shall probably find it expedient to condense Lake's record to some extent. Mr. Warby was born, it appeared, about the year 1828. His father before him had been connected with the cathedral, and likewise his grandfather. One or both had been choristers, and in later life both had done work as mason and carpenter respectively about the fabric. Warby himself, though possessed, as he frankly acknowledged, of an indifferent voice, had been drafted into the choir at about 10 years of age. It was in 1840 that the wave of the Gothic revival smote the Cathedral of Southminster. There was a lot of lovely stuff went then, sir, said Warby with a sigh. My father couldn't hardly believe it when he got his orders to clear out the choir. There was a new dean just come in, Dean Burscough it was, and my father had been apprenticed to a good firm of joiners in the city, and knew what good work was when he saw it. Cruel it was, he used to say. All that beautiful wainscot oak, as good as the day it was put up, and garlands like of foliage and fruit, and lovely old gilding work on the coats of arms and the organ pipes, all went to the timber yard, every bit, except some little pieces worked up in the lady chapel, and here, in this overmantel. Well, I may be mistook, but I say our choir never looked as well since. Still, there was a lot found out about the history of the church, and no doubt but what it did stand in need of repair. There was very few winters passed but what we'd lose a pinnacle. Mr. Lake expressed his concurrence with Warby's views of restoration, but owns to a fear about this point lest the story proper should never be reached. Possibly this was perceptible in his manner. Warby hastened to reassure him. Not but what I could carry on about that topic for hours at a time, and do when I see my opportunity, but Dean Burscough, he was very set on the Gothic period, and nothing would serve him, but everything must be made agreeable to that. And one morning after service he appointed for my father to meet him in the choir, and he came back after he'd taken off his robes in the vestry, and he got a roll of paper with him, and the verger that was then brought in a table, and they begun spreading it out on the table, with a prayer books to keep it down, and my father helped him, and he saw it was a picture of the inside of a choir in a cathedral, and the dean, he was a quick-spoken gentleman. He says, 'Well, Warby, what do you think of that?' 'Why,' says my father, 'I don't think I have the pleasure of knowing that view. Would that be Hereford Cathedral, Mr. Dean?' 'No, Warby,' says the dean, 'that's Southminster Cathedral, as we hope to see it before many years.' 'Indeed, sir,' says my father, and that was all he did say, leastways to the dean, but he used to tell me he really felt faint in himself when he looked around our choir, as I can remember it, all comfortable and furnished like, and then see this nasty little dry picter, as he called it, drawn out by some London architect. Well, there I am again. But you'll see what I mean if you look at this old view." Warby reached down a framed print from the wall. "Well, the long and short of it was that the dean handed over to my father a copy of an order of the chapter that he was to clear out every bit of the choir, make a clean sweep, ready for the new work that was being designed up in town, and he was to put it in hand as soon as ever he could get the breakers together. Now then, sir, if you look at that view, you'll see where the pulpit used to stand. That's what I want you to notice, if you please. It was indeed easily seen. An unusually large structure of timber, with a domed sounding board standing at the east end of the stalls on the north side of the choir, facing the bishop's throne. Warby proceeded to explain that during the alteration services were held in the nave, the members of the choir being thereby disappointed of an anticipated holiday, and the organist in particular incurring the suspicion of having wilfully damaged the mechanism of the temporary organ that was hired at considerable expense from London. The work of demolition began with the choir screen and organ loft, and proceeding gradually eastwards, disclosing, as Warby said, many interesting features of older work. While this was going on, the members of the chapter were naturally in and about the choir a great deal, and it soon became apparent to the elder Warby, who could not help overhearing some of their talk, that, on the part of the senior canons especially, there must have been a good deal of disagreement before the policy now being carried out had been adopted. Some were of opinion that they should catch their deaths of cold in the return stalls, unprotected by a screen from the draughts in the nave. Others objected to being exposed to the view of persons in the choir aisles, especially, they said, during the sermons, when they found it helpful to listen in a posture which was liable to misconstruction. The strongest opposition, however, came from the oldest of the body, who up to the last moment objected to the removal of the pulpit. "You ought not to touch it, Mr. Dean," he said with great emphasis one morning when the two were standing before it. "You don't know what mischief you may do." "Mischief? It's not a work of any particular merit, Canon." "Don't call me Canon," said the old man with great asperity. "That is, for 30 years I've been known as Dr. Aloff, and I shall be obliged, Mr. Dean, if you would kindly humor me in that manner. And as to the pulpit, which I've preached from for 30 years, though I don't insist on that, all I'll say is, I know you're doing wrong in moving it." "But what sense could there be, my dear doctor, in leaving it where it is, when we're fitting up the rest of the choir in a totally different style? What reason could be given apart from the look of the thing?" Reason, said old Dr. Aloff. "If you, young man, if I may say so without any disrespect, Mr. Dean, if you'd only listen to reason a little, and not be always asking for it, we should get on better. There, I've said my say." The old gentleman hobbled off, and as it proved, never entered the cathedral again. The season, it was a hot summer, turned sickly on a sudden. Dr. Aloff was one of the first to go, with some affection of the muscles of the thorax, which took him painfully at night, and at many services the number of choirmen and boys was very thin. Meanwhile the pulpit had been done away with. In fact, the sounding board, part of which still exists as a table in a summer house in the palace garden, was taken down within an hour or two of Dr. Aloff's protest. The removal of the base, not effected without considerable trouble, disclosed to view, greatly to the exultation of the restoring party, an altar tomb. The tomb, of course, to which Warby had attracted Lake's attention that same evening. Much fruitless research was expended in attempts to identify the occupant. From that day to this he has never had a name put to him. The structure had been most carefully boxed in under the pulpit base, so that such slight ornament as it possessed was not defaced. Only on the north side of it there was what looked like an injury, a gap, between two of the slabs composing the side. It might be 2 or 3 inches across. Palmer, the mason, was directed to fill it up in a week's time, when he came to do some other small jobs near that part of the choir. The season was undoubtedly a very trying one, whether the church was built on a site that had once been a marsh, as was suggested, or for whatever reason. The residents in its immediate neighborhood had, many of them, but little enjoyment of the exquisite sunny days and the calm nights of August and September. To several of the older people, Dr. Alov among others, as we have seen, the summer proved downright fatal, but even among the younger, few escaped either a sojourn in bed for a matter of weeks, or at the least a brooding sense of oppression, accompanied by hateful nightmares. Gradually there formulated itself a suspicion, which grew into a conviction that the alterations in the cathedral had something to say in the matter. The widow of a former old verger, a pensioner of the chapter of Southminster, was visited by dreams, which she retailed to her friends, of a shape that slipped out of the little door of the south transept as the dark fell in, and flitted, taking a fresh direction every night, about the close, disappearing for a while in house after house, and finally emerging again when the night sky was paling. She could see nothing of it, she said, but that it was a moving form, only she had an impression that when it returned to the church, as it seemed to do in the end of the dream, it turned its head. And then, she could not tell why, but she thought it had red eyes. Warby remembered hearing the old lady tell this dream at a tea party in the house of the chapter clerk. Its recurrence might, perhaps, he said, be taken as a symptom of approaching illness. At any rate, before the end of September, the old lady was in her grave. The interest excited by the restoration of this great church was not confined to its own county. One day that summer, an FSA of some celebrity visited the place. His business was to write an account of the discoveries that had been made for the Society of Antiquaries, and his wife, who accompanied him, was to make a series of illustrative drawings for his report. In the morning she employed herself in making a general sketch of the choir. In the afternoon she devoted herself to details. She first drew the newly exposed altar tomb, and when that was finished she called her husband's attention to a beautiful piece of diaper ornament on the screen just behind it, which had, like the tomb itself, been completely concealed by the pulpit. Of course, he said, an illustration of that must be made, so she seated herself on the tomb and began a careful drawing which occupied her till dusk. Her husband had by this time finished his work of measuring and description, and they agreed that it was time to be getting back to their hotel. "You may as well brush my skirt, Frank," said the lady. "It must have got covered with dust, I'm sure." He obeyed dutifully, but after a moment he said, "I don't know whether you value this dress particularly, my dear, but I'm inclined to think it's seen its best days. There's a great bit of it gone." "Gone? Where?" she said. "I don't know where it's gone, but it's off at the bottom edge behind here." She pulled it hastily into sight and was horrified to find a jagged tear extending some way into the substance of the stuff, very much, she said, as if a dog had rent it away. The dress was, in any case, hopelessly spoilt, to her great vexation, and though they looked everywhere, the missing piece could not be found. There were many ways, they concluded, in which the injury might have come about, for the choir was full of old bits of woodwork with nails sticking out of them. Finally, they could only suppose that one of these had caused the mischief, and that the workman, who had been about all days, had carried off the particular piece with the fragment of dress still attached to it. It was about this time, Warby thought, that his little dog began to wear an anxious expression when the hour for it to be put into the shed in the backyard approached, for his mother had ordained that it must not sleep in the house. One evening, he said, when he was just going to pick it up and carry it out, it looked at him like a Christian and waved its hand, and I was going to say, well, you know how they do carry on sometimes, and at the end of it was I put it under my coat and huddled it upstairs, and I'm afraid I as good as deceived my poor mother on the subject. After that, the dog acted very artful with hiding itself under the bed for half an hour or more before bedtime came, and we worked it so as my mother never found out what we'd done. Of course, Warby was glad of its company anyhow, but more particularly when the nuisance that is still remembered in Southminster as the crying set in. "Night after night," said Warby, "that dog seemed to know it was coming. He'd creep out, he would, and snuggle into the bed and cuddle right up to me shivering, and when the crying come, he'd be like a wild thing, shoving his head under my arm, and I was fully near his bed. 6 or 7 times we'd hear it, not more, and when he'd draw out his head again, I'd know it was over for that night. What was it like, sir? Well, I never heard but one thing that seemed to hit it off. I happened to be playing about in the close, and there was 2 of the canons met and said good morning, and one to the other, "Sleep well last night?" says one. It was Mr. Enslow, that one, and Mr. Lyle was the other. "Can't say I did," says Mr. Lyle. "Rather too much of Isaiah 34:14 for me." 34:14, says Mr. Henslow. "What's that?" "You call yourself a Bible reader," says Mr. Lyle. "Mr. Henslow, you must know he was one of what used to be termed Simeon's Law, pretty much what we should call the evangelical party. You should go and look it up." I wanted to know what he was getting at myself, and so off I ran home and got out my own Bible, and there it was. "The satyr shall cry to his fellow." Well, I thought, is that what we've been listening to these past nights? And I tell you, it made me look over my shoulder a time or two. Of course, I'd asked my father and mother about what it could be before that, but they both said it was most likely cats, but they spoke very short, and I could see they was troubled. My word, that was a noise. Hungry like. As if it was calling after someone that wouldn't come. If ever you felt you wanted company, it would be when you was waiting for it to begin again. I believe 2 or 3 nights there was men put on to watch in different parts of the close, but they all used to get together in one corner the nearest they could to High Street, and nothing came of it. Well, the next thing was this. Me and another of the boys, he's in business in the city now as a grocer, like his father before him, we'd gone up in the close after morning service was over, and we heard old Palmer, the mason, bellowing to some of his men, so we went up nearer because we knew he was a rusty old chap and there might be some fun going. It appears Palmer told his man to stop up the hole in that old tomb, but, well, there was this man keeping on saying he'd done it the best he could, and there was Palmer carrying on like all possessed about it. "Call that making a job of it?" he says. "If you had your rights, you'd get the sack for this. What do you suppose I pay you your wages for? What do you suppose I'm going to say to the dean and the chapter when they come around, as come they may do any time, and see where you've been bungling about covering the whole place with mess and plaster and Lord knows what?" "Well, master, I done the best I could," says the man. "I don't know no more than what you do how it come to fall out this way. I tempted it right in the 'ole," he says, "and now it's fell out," he says. "I never see." "Fell out," says old Palmer. "Why, it's nowhere near the place. Blowed out, you mean." And he picked up a bit of plaster, and so did I, that was laying up against the screen 3 or 4 feet off and not dry yet, and old Palmer, he looked at it curious like, and then he turned round on me and he says, "Now then, you boys, have you been up to some of your games here?" "No," I says, "I haven't, Mr. Palmer. There's none of us been around here until just this minute." And while I was talking to the other boy, Evans, he got looking in through the hole, and I heard him drawing his breath, and he came away sharp and up to us, and says he, "I believe that there's something in there. I saw something shiny." "What? I dare say," says old Palmer. "Well, I ain't got time to stop about here. You, William, you go off and get some more stuff and make a job of it this time. If not, there'll be trouble in my yard," he says. So the man went off, and Palmer too, and us boys stopped behind, and I says to Evans, "Did you really see anything in there?" "Yes," he says, "I did indeed." So then I says, "Let's shove something in and stir it up," and we tried several bits of the wood that was laying about, but they were all too big. Then Evans, he had a sheet of music he'd brought with him, an anthem or a service, I forget what it was now, and he rolled it up small and shoved it in the hole. 2 or 3 times he did it, and nothing happened. "Give it to me, boy," I said, and I had a try. Nothing happened. Then, I don't know why I thought of it, I'm sure, but I stooped down just opposite the hole and put my 2 fingers in my mouth and whistled. You know the way. And at that, I seemed to think I heard something stirring, and I says to Evans, "Come away," I says. "I don't like this." "Oh, rot," he says. "Give me that roll," and he took it and shoved it in, and I don't think I see anyone go so pale as he did. "I say, Warby," he says, "it's caught. Or else someone's got a hold of it." "Pull it out or leave it," I says. "Come and let's go off." So he gave a good pull, and it came away. Leastways, most of it did, but the end was gone. Torn off it was. And Evans looked at it for a second, and then he gave a sort of croak and let it drop, and we both made off out of there as quick as ever we could see. When we got outside, Evans says to me, "Did you see the end of that paper?" "No," I said, "only it was torn." "Yes, it was," he said, "but it was wet too, and black. Well, partly because of the fright we had, and partly because that music was wanted in a day or two, and we knew there'd be a set out about it with the organist. We didn't say nothing to anyone else, and I suppose the workmen, they swept up the bit that was left along with the rest of the rubbish, but Evans, if you were to ask him this very day about it, he'd stick to it. He saw that paper was wet and black at the end where it was torn. After that, the boys gave the choir a wide berth so that Warby was not sure what was the result of the mason's renewed mending of the tomb. Only he made out from fragments of conversation dropped by the workmen passing through the choir that some difficulty had been met with, and that the governor, Mr. Palmer to wit, had tried his own hand at the job. A little later he happened to see Mr. Palmer himself knocking at the door of the deanery and being admitted by the butler. A day or so after that he gathered from a remark his father let fall at breakfast that something a little out of the common was to be done in the cathedral after morning service on the morrow. "And I'd just as soon it was done today," his father said. "I don't see use of running risks." "Father," I says, "what are you going to do in the cathedral tomorrow?" And he turned on me as savage as I ever seen him. He was a wonderful good-tempered man as a general thing, my father was. "My lad," he says, "I'll trouble you not to go picking up your elders' and betters' talk. It's not manners and it's not straight. What I'm going to do or not going to do in the cathedral tomorrow is none of your business, and if I catch sight of you hanging about the place tomorrow after your work's done, I'll send you home with a flea in your ear. Now you mind that." Of course I said I was very sorry, and equally of course I went off and laid plans with Evans. We knew there was a stair up in the corner of the transept which you can get up to the triforium, and in them days the door to it was pretty well always open. And even if it wasn't, we knew the key usually laid under a bit of matting hard by, so we made up our minds we'd be putting away music, and that next morning, while the rest of the boys was clearing off, and then slip up the stairs and watch from the triforium if there was any signs of work going on. Well, that same night, I dropped off asleep as sound as a boy does, and all of a sudden the dog woke me up coming into the bed, and thought I, now we're going to get it sharp, for he seemed more frightened than usual. After about 5 minutes, sure enough, came this cry. I can't give you no idea what it was like, and so near, too, nearer than I'd heard it yet. And a funny thing, Mr. Lake, you know what a place this close is for an echo, and particular if you stand this side of it. Well, this crying never made no sign of an echo at all. But as I said, it was dreadful near this night, and on the top of the start I got with hearing it, I got another fright, for I heard something rustling outside in the passage. Now, to be sure, I thought I was done, but I noticed the dog seemed to perk up a bit, and next there was someone whispered outside the door, and I very near laughed out loud, for I knew it was my father and mother that had got out of bed with the noise. "Whatever is it?" says my mother. "Hush, I don't know," says my father, excited like. "Don't disturb the boy. I hope he didn't hear nothing." So me knowing they were just outside, it made me bolder, and I slipped out of bed across to my little window, giving on the close, but the dog, he bored right down to the bottom of the bed, and I looked out. First go off, couldn't see anything. Then right down in the shadow under a buttress I made out what I shall always say was 2 spots of red. A dull red it was. Nothing like a lamp or a fire, but just so as you could pick 'em out of the black shadow. I hadn't but just sighted 'em when it seemed we wasn't the only people that had been disturbed, because I see a window in the house on the left-hand side become lighted up, and the light moving. I just turned my head to make sure of it, and then looked back into the shadow for those 2 red things, and they were gone. And for all I peered about and stared, there was not a sign more of 'em. Then come my last fright that night. Something come against my bare leg. Oh, but that was all right. That was my little dog had come out of bed and prancing about, making a great to-do, only holding his tongue, and me seeing he was quite in spirits again. I took him back to bed, and we slept the night out. Next morning I made out to tell my mother I'd had the dog in my room, and I was surprised, after all she'd said about it before, how quiet she took it. "Did you?" she says. "Well, by good rights, you ought to go without your breakfast for doing such a thing behind my back, but I don't know as there's any great harm done, only another time you ask my permission, do you hear?" A bit after that I said something to my father about having heard the cats again. "Cats," he says, and he looked over at my poor mother, and she coughed, and he says, "Oh, yes, cats. I believe I heard 'em myself." That was a funny morning altogether. Nothing seemed to go right. The organist, he stopped in bed, and the minor canon, he forgot it was the 19th day and waited for the Venite, and after a bit the deputy, he set off playing the chant for the evensong, which was minor, and then the decani boys were laughing so much they couldn't sing, and when it came to the anthem, the solo boy, he got took with the giggles, and made out his nose was bleeding, and shoved the book at me, what hadn't practiced the verse, and wasn't much of a singer if I had known it. Well, things was rougher, you see, 50 years ago, and I got a nip from the countertenor behind me that I remembered. So we got through somehow, and neither the men nor the boys weren't by way of waiting to see whether the canon in residence, Mr. Henslow it was, would come to the vestries and fine him, but I don't believe he did. For one thing, I fancy he'd read the wrong lesson for the first time in his life, and knew it. Anyhow, Evans and me didn't find no difficulty in slipping up the stairs, as I told you, and when we got up, we laid ourselves down flat on our stomachs where we could just stretch our heads out over the old tomb, and we hadn't but just done so when we heard the verger that was then first shutting the iron porch gates and locking the southwest door and then the transept door, so we knew there was something up, and they meant to keep the public out for a bit. Next thing was, the dean and the canon came in by their door on the north, and then I see my father and old Palmer and a couple of their best men, and Palmer stood a-talking for a bit with the dean in the middle of the choir. He had a coil of rope, and the men had crows. All of 'em looked a bit nervous. So there they stood, talking, and at last I heard the dean say, "Well, I've no time to waste, Palmer. If you think this'll satisfy Southminster people, I'll permit it to be done, but I must say this, that never in this whole course of my life have I heard such arrant nonsense from a practical man as I have from you. Don't you agree with me, Henslow?" As far as I could hear, Mr. Henslow said, "Oh, well, we're told, aren't we, Mr. Dean, not to judge others?" And the dean, he gave a kind of sniff and walked straight up to the tomb and took his stand behind it with his back to the screen, and the others, they come edging up rather gingerly. Henslow, he stopped on the south side and scratched on his chin, he did. Then the dean spoke up. "Palmer," he says, "which can you do easiest, get the slab off the top or shift one of the side slabs?" Now old Palmer and his men, they pottered about a bit, looking round the edge of the top slab and sounding the sides on the south and east and west and everywhere but the north. Henslow said something about it being better to have a try at the south side because there was more light and more room to move about in. Then my father, who'd been watching of them, went round to the north side and knelt down and felt the slab by the hole, and he got up and dusted his knees and says to the dean, "Beg pardon, Mr. Dean, but I think if Mr. Palmer'll try this here slab, he'll find it'll come out easy enough. Seems to me one of the men could prise it out with his crow by means of this hole." "Ah, thank you, Warby," says the dean. "That's a good suggestion, Palmer. Let one of your men do that, will you?" So the man come round and put his bar in and bore on it, and just that minute when they were all bending over and we boys got our heads well out over the edge of the triforium, there come a most fearful crash down at the west end of the choir, as if a whole stack of big timber had fallen down a flight of stairs. Well, you can't expect me to tell you everything that happened all in a minute. Of course, there was a terrible commotion. I heard the slab fall out and the crowbar on the floor, and I heard the dean say, "Good God!" And when I looked down again, I saw the dean tumbled over on the floor. The men was making off down the choir. Henslow was just going to help the dean up. Palmer was going to stop the men, as he said afterwards, and my father was sitting on the altar step with his face in his hands. The dean, he was very cross. "I wish to goodness you'd look where you're coming to, Henslow," he said. "Why you should all take to your heels when a stick of wood tumbles down, I can't imagine." And all Henslow could do, explaining he was right away on the other side of the tomb, would not satisfy him. Then Palmer came back and reported there was nothing to account for this noise, and nothing seemingly fallen down, and when the dean finished feeling of himself, they gathered round, except my father. He sat where he was, and someone lighted up a bit of candle, and they looked in the tomb. "Nothing there," says the dean. "What did I tell you? Stay. Here's something. What's this? A bit of music paper and a piece of torn stuff. Part of a dress, it looks like. Both quite modern, no interest whatsoever. Another time perhaps you'll take the advice of an educated man, or something like that." And off he went, limping a bit, and out through the north door, only as he went, he called back angry to Palmer for leaving the door standing open. Palmer called out, "Very sorry, sir," but he shrugged his shoulders, and Henslow says, "I fancy Mr. Dean's mistaken. I closed the door behind me, but he's a little upset." Then Palmer says, "Why, where's Warby?" And they saw him sitting on the step and went up to him. He was recovering himself, it seemed, and wiping his forehead, and Palmer helped him up onto his legs, as I was glad to see. They were too far off for me to hear what they said, but my father pointed to the north door in the aisle, and Palmer and Henslow, both of them, looked very surprised and scared, and after a bit, my father and Henslow went out of the church, and the others made what haste they could to put the slab back and plaster it in, and about as the clock struck 12, the cathedral was opened up again, and us boys made the best of our way home. I was in great taking to know what it was had given my poor father such a turn, and when I got in and found him sitting in his chair taking a glass of spirits, and my mother standing looking anxious at him, I couldn't keep from bursting out and making confession where I'd been. but he didn't seem to take on, not in the way of losing his temper. You was there, was you? Well, did you see it? I see everything, Father, I said, except when the noise came. Did you see what it was knocked the Dean over, he says. That what came out of the monument. You didn't? Well, that's a mercy. Why, what was it, Father? I said. Come, you must have seen it, he says. Didn't you see? A thing like a man, all over hair and two great eyes to it? Well, that was all I could get out of him that time, and later on he seemed as if he was ashamed of being so frightened, and he used to put me off when I asked him about it, but years after, when I was got to be a grown man, we had more talk now and again on the matter, and he always said the same thing. Black it was, he say, a mass of hair and two legs, and the light caught on its eyes. Well, that's the tale of that too, Mr. Lake. It's one we don't tell to our visitors, and I should be obliged to you not to make any use of it till I'm out of the way. I doubt Mr. Evans will feel the same as I do if you ask him. That proved to be the case. But over 20 years have passed by, and the grass is growing over both Warby and Evans, so Mr. Lake felt no difficulty about communicating his notes taken in 1890 to me. He accompanied them with a sketch of the tomb and a copy of the short inscription on the metal cross which was affixed at the expense of Dr. Lisle to the center of the northern side. It was from the Vulgate of Isaiah 34 and consisted merely of 3 words. Ibi cubavit lamia. And I think that is a good place to leave off tonight because we are at 9 o'clock. So I hope you'll join me Thursday as we continue through Little Nightmares. We will probably start a new game soon. It looks like we're going pretty quickly through Little Nightmares. Could be wrong. I might really mess up on Thursday. And then join me again on Sunday as we continue going through M.R. James short stories. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope you have a lovely rest of your weekend, and good night.